unstable rice market and the 1962 rice crisis.
In this segment, we will explore the challenges of food insecurity in post-liberation South Korea, focusing on the seasonal hunger period known as the Barley Hump. We will examine the structure of rice economy, impact of American food aid, rural household debt, and population shifts to urban areas that collectively contributed to chronic food shortages during the 1950s and 1960s. Even after liberation in 1945, farmers continued to suffer from exploitative economic conditions. They were forced to sell half of their harvest at less than half the market value, while bearing the full burden of rampant inflation. In an attempt to combat the devastating inflation, the South Korean government devalued the currency to 1% of its previous value and further lowered the rice procurement price. Although it eventually helped stabilize rice prices, farmers once again had to bear substantial financial losses. Until the end of the 1960s, the South Korean government still failed in stabilizing the rice prices. Extremely volatile rice prices were perceived as significant challenges for both farmers and consumers. Despite the currency devaluation, rice prices kept fluctuating in the 1960s, largely driven by inconsistent harvests, government policies, and market speculation. In 1962, South Korea faced a particularly severe rice crisis when harvest yields fell much short of expectation. This shortage triggered an unprecedented price spike, with the rice prices soaring by 400% compared to the previous year. The sudden inflation created widespread food insecurity and social unrest. During this crisis, North Korea seized a propaganda opportunity by offering to send rice as humanitarian aid to South Korea. This gesture was deliberately calculated to embarrass the newly established Park Chung-hee government. For Park, who had staked his legitimacy on promises of economic development and national self-sufficiency, the North Korean offer was deeply humiliating, even undermining his leadership. The 1962 rice crisis and North Korea's propaganda maneuver became a pivotal moment that shaped agricultural policy for the next decade. Park administration responded by intensifying efforts to increase domestic rice production while implementing strict consumption control measures through the mixed grain or 혼식 and flour-based diet or 분식 policies. The experience reinforced Park's determination to achieve agricultural self-sufficiency as both an economic necessity and a matter of national security and pride.
Impact of American surplus agriculture products.
Amid the continuing instability in the rice market, another government policy actually dealt an even greater blow to farmers: the large-scale importation of wheat flour from the United States. Historically, wheat was not an important part of Koreans' everyday diet until enormous amounts of wheat were released in South Korea through American foreign aid programs. In any Korean museum related to modern history, visitors can easily spot displays of flour sacks, distinctive sacks with an image of shaking hands against the backdrop of the American flag, accompanied by the phrase Korean-American cooperation. This humanitarian assistance continued while the Korean economy remained underdeveloped, but the introduction of American wheat flour underwent significant changes when U.S. aid policies shifted in the mid-1950s with the aforementioned PL-480 enacted. The PL-480 allowed developing countries to pay for American food imports in their own currencies instead of using US dollars, and eventually accelerated the influx of American wheat flour into the South Korean market. This change satisfied the interests of both the Seungman Lee government, struggling with grain shortages, and the United States, which was seeking markets for its agricultural surpluses following World War II. In the 1950s and 1960s, American wheat contributed substantially to sustaining Koreans on the verge of famine, but the massive importation of American wheat effectively eradicated wheat farming in South Korea. The flood of American wheat also affected rice farmers, as the low price of American wheat prevented the rise of the market price of rice. Similarly, the large-scale importation of cotton led to the collapse of domestic cotton production infrastructure. Although wheat was still foreign to them, South Koreans essentially had no choice but to embrace it amid the ruins of the Korean War. As bread was too unfamiliar to most Koreans, many South Koreans became acquainted with wheat through dishes that resembled existing Chinese or Japanese dishes or could be prepared in Korean ways. Soup with dough flakes, sujebi, noodle soup, and dumplings were introduced into everyday South Korean menus by the late 1950s. Jjajangmyeon, a localized variation of Chinese noodles with black bean sauce, jjajangmyeon, was popularized in the mid-1950s and eventually became the most popular family eating out option since the 1960s.
The paradox of increased production and worsening shortages.
Average South Koreans in the 1960s faced a paradox in their meals. Despite significant increases in rice production, the perceived rice supply situation actually worsened for individual citizens. This occurred because as national income gradually rose, barley consumption decreased dramatically while demand for rice surged. When the increased demands outpaced the growth of rice production, the government had no choice but to import rice. The situation was particularly acute in the fall of 1962, as we saw in the previous section. As a result, rice monoculture intensified, yet rice farming remained unprofitable. This occurred because the government continued to release inexpensive wheat flour into the market to suppress rice prices. The government chose an easier solution of flooding the market with cheaper grains rather than addressing the more challenging task of improving the rice distribution structure. Consequently, farmers found themselves in dire straits where the harder they worked, the deeper they sank into debt. The debt problem in South Korean rural households during the 1950s and 1960s severely hampered agricultural development and rural livelihoods. By the late 1950s, the average debt of farm households had reached approximately 30 to 40% of their annual income. According to government surveys, more than 75% of rural households were indebted by 1960, mostly with high-interest private loans. These private loans often carried interest rates of 5 to 10% per month, translating to stunning annual rates of 60 to 120%. Another survey in 1964 revealed that the average farm household debt had reached about 40% of annual farm income. The debt-to-income ratio was particularly severe for small-scale farmers with less than 0.5 hectares of land, where debt often exceeded 60% of their annual income. The impact of this debt crisis was profound. Many farmers were forced to sell their land to pay off debts, creating a new class of tenant farmers or driving rural to urban migration. By the mid-1960s, approximately 300,000 farmers had lost their land due to debt burdens. The government attempted to address this through the Agricultural Cooperative Federation's debt relief programs in 1961 and 1967, but these measures provided only temporary relief without addressing the underlying structural issues of the agricultural economy.
Population growth and urbanization.
As mentioned earlier, the food provisioning problem in South Korea was made even more complicated by the ever-growing population. The post-Korean War era witnessed a dramatic demographic transformation in South Korea. Between 1955 and 1970, South Korea's population surged from approximately 21.5 million to over 32 million, representing a staggering 50% increase in just 15 years. This rapid population growth alone placed tremendous pressure on food supplies, especially rice. Compounding this population explosion was a massive rural to urban migration that fundamentally altered the country's demographic landscape. In 1960, only about 28% of South Koreans lived in urban areas. By 1970, this figure had jumped to nearly 41%, and by 1980, urban residents constituted over 57% of the population. Seoul's population alone more than doubled during the 1960s as rural migrants flooded into the capital, seeking industrial employment opportunities offered by the government's export-oriented industrialization policies. This rapid urbanization created a dual challenge for food security. First, it dramatically reduced the agricultural workforce while increasing the number of consumers dependent on market-purchased food. The proportion of the labor force engaged in agriculture declined from over 60% in the early 1960s to around 50% by 1970. Second, as incomes gradually rose among urban workers, their dietary preferences shifted toward a higher consumption of rice as opposed to cheaper barley or other grains. It significantly increased demand for South Korea's preferred but limited staple crop. The government's urban-focused industrial development strategy further complicated matters by driving significant wage disparities between urban and rural sectors. Despite various agricultural support policies, farm incomes lagged behind urban incomes, encouraging further rural exodus and creating a vicious cycle that threatened the very foundation of the country's food production capacity. This demographic transformation made achieving food self-sufficiency an increasingly distant goal and heightened the political urgency of addressing what became known as the Barley Hump period of annual food shortages.